The morning always began the same way, with the gray light breaking through the curtains with quiet, barely perceptible sounds. The house was peaceful, but the more I tried to immerse myself in this world of silence, the clearer it became that something was wrong. I made breakfast as usual, with almost mechanical precision, taking out ingredients from the fridge, cutting the bread, frying the eggs. All these actions were familiar, yet they hid an unconscious emptiness. I didn't feel like a part of this house. It was just a house that kept existing, and I was no more than a figure within its gray walls. Jason sat on the couch, absorbed in the screen of his laptop, completely unaware of my presence. Once, his attention was the center of my universe, but now there was a chasm between us, a chasm we both remained silent about. We hadn't spoken about anything important in a long time, and even the simple phrases we exchanged seemed like echoes of other people's voices. Jason's gaze was tired, and his silence was cold. I couldn't understand why we couldn't return to the ease we once had, when everything was fresh, new, and full of meaning. I placed a cup of coffee in front of him, but he didn't even glance up. A few times the thought crossed my mind that maybe I should say something, somehow break the circle of silent confinement. But then I immediately dismissed these thoughts. Too many words, too many attempts for everything to stay the same. And so, I sat at the table, drinking my coffee, feeling how this life was slipping away, suffocating, with neither a beginning nor an end. It was a routine that brought neither joy nor pain, just emptiness. Sometimes I felt like I had ceased to exist in his world, and he, in mine. We both stayed in our places, but neither of us knew what to do next. I could no longer stay. The moment I placed my cup on the table, all the internal emptiness that had built up over the past months seemed to burst through. It wasn't a moment of anger, nor a moment of pain. It was simply a decision. I could no longer wait for everything to change on its own. I stood up, walked to the closet, and grabbed my bag, without a word. He didn't even notice I had left. When I found myself outside, I felt the weight I had been carrying inside me lighten, even if just a little. It was a strange relief, almost physical. I needed to change something. The transition into a new world, into a new reality, didn't seem so terrifying. I got into the car, not even thinking about how all of this would look. Mom. I thought of her, and in that moment, she became my anchor. The road to Linda's was short, but every kilometer stretched on like a separate life. The landscapes changed, but everything remained equally quiet and empty. I didn't know exactly what I was searching for in that house, but I knew one thing. It was safe there. This place was my refuge, though I hadn't realized it until I was already on my way. Thoughts of Jason swirled in my head. I couldn't quite say why we had become so distant, but the feeling as though he no longer existed, as if he was just part of the background, blurred and unclear, never stopped haunting me. Everything that had once connected us had become so distant that I couldn't figure out when it had happened. Maybe I hadn't noticed how we started to drift apart. Maybe it was just in my head, and I was simply afraid to admit it. I pulled up to my mother's house. In that moment, everything around me felt familiar, even cozy. But when I saw her on the porch, I realized she knew. Mom had always been a keen psychologist, and her gaze spoke more than any words could. She didn't ask anything, but I knew. She understood what had happened. And though she was happy to see me, her eyes were filled with concern. I felt her care seep into me, wrapping around me like a warm blanket on a cold day. This was her house, her world, and I was ready to sink into its comfort for a while. Mom greeted me warmly, as always, and immediately offered me a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table on the old wooden chair I remembered from my childhood. Everything here was so familiar. From the smell of fresh bread to the sound of the old wall clock, its ticking evoking memories. She didn't mention my leaving, but I could feel her gaze sliding over me, trying to understand what was happening. Mom never pressured me, but in her silence, there were always more questions than in any conversation. I tried to get up and occupy myself. It was my salvation. Doing something mindlessly and mechanically, something that distracted me from my thoughts. I started washing the dishes, wiping down the counters, checking if I'd forgotten anything in the fridge. These actions required no effort, and in them I could lose myself. It was a calmness I could be thankful for. But thoughts of Jason wouldn't let go. They were like persistent shadows, always returning. I couldn't understand why, even being here in my mother's house, I still felt unsettled. This was the house where I'd always felt safe. Yet now, even here, something seemed off, as though it wasn't how it was supposed to be. Was it just guilt for leaving Jason? Or was it the fear that I'd never regain what I had lost? I went to the garden. Mom had always cared for the plants, and this garden was her pride. Lost in her work, she forgot all her worries and simply lived in a world of flowers and trees. I gently approached the roses she loved so much. Their fragrance filled the air, and I felt as if, for a moment, this moment was returning me to an earlier time, a time before foggy mornings and heavy decisions. "I'm glad you're here," Mom said, appearing beside me. She looked at me, but I could see her concern growing with each passing day. She couldn't help but notice that I had changed, that something inside me had broken. I nodded silently. Sometimes no words are needed to understand that someone understands you. Mom knew I couldn't go back to what it was before, and she didn't ask what had happened, didn't try to interfere. She simply stayed close. This was what I valued most right now. A few days later, when I had already started getting used to the quiet and steady pace of life at my mother's, she unexpectedly said, "By the way, Eric is coming home for a few days. I don't know what happened to him, but he said he's having problems at work and needs to rest." Her brother's name slipped from her lips so calmly that for a moment I felt like a little girl again, the one she would discuss her worries with. Eric. I remembered him as a teenager, shy, sullen, often running off to his room and not wanting to participate in family matters. He had always been quiet, withdrawn. I couldn't even remember the last time we had spoken. I became curious about what he had become. Eric was younger than me, but as a child, he had always been my only brother. We grew up together, but at some point, our paths diverged, and each of us moved on with our own lives. I couldn't understand what had brought him back home, and why he chose this moment to return. "Are you worried about something?" Mom asked, noticing how I suddenly became lost in thought. I nodded, unable to explain what was making me uneasy. It was a strange feeling. On the one hand, I was glad he was coming back, but on the other, there was something foreign about it, something that made me uneasy. A few days later, as I sat in the kitchen, I heard the car door slam, and Eric entered the house. I turned around, and he was standing in the doorway holding a large bag. He was much taller than I remembered, and his confidence was obvious. The look he gave me was calm, but there was something new in it. Not the shyness I was used to seeing, but an adult gaze, like someone who had been through a lot and now felt solid on their feet. "Hi," he said, his voice a bit rough but still pleasant. I felt a sudden jolt inside me. It was strange to see him like this. He was no longer the reserved teenager, and that realization threw me off. Mom happily exclaimed, "Eric, just like always. Why did you bring so many things with you?" He smiled in response, but that smile was different too. Not like the one from before. He seemed like a collected, self-assured person, not the one I remembered. That evening, we had dinner together, and although the conversations were light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. We sat at the table, and I kept catching myself staring at him as if he were a completely different person. I had a sudden desire to get to know him again, to see what he had become over all these years. The next day, Mom suggested that I share a room with Eric since there wasn't much space in the house. I was taken aback. I had never imagined that, at nearly 30 years old, I would again be sharing a room with my brother. It wasn't just strange. It felt like a return to childhood when we were still teenagers and the world seemed much simpler. I agreed, although I wasn't sure how I would feel about it. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was no big deal. We were brother and sister. Everything would be fine. But as soon as I entered his room, everything started to change. In the corner stood a desk piled with papers, and posters I had never seen before were hanging on the walls. Eric had clearly changed, and I couldn't shake the thought that, over the years we hadn't spoken, he had become someone foreign to me. That evening, when we both settled in the room, I noticed how strange his presence felt. We sat on separate beds, silent, as if someone had suddenly shut off the familiar conversations we used to have. I tried to feel comfortable, but every glance, every word I tried to speak felt out of place. Foreign. He was there, but I didn't know how to talk to this person. Eric didn't notice my unease. He was calm in his own way, like someone who had learned to deal with things as they came. He talked about his work, his friends, how the city had changed while he was away. I listened, but his words seemed to bounce off me, leaving nothing behind. I tried to respond, but I couldn't find the right words. It was a meeting with someone who had once been close to you, yet was now so distant. At night, I couldn't fall asleep for a long time, staring at the ceiling while Eric slept soundly. I could hear his steady breathing, and it felt unbearably alien. This wasn't the Eric I had grown up with. This was an adult who had re-entered my life, but now I couldn't understand who he truly was. I kept glancing at him as I thought about my own situation. I still couldn't find my way. All of this felt too new, and I wasn't ready to understand why his presence in my life had suddenly become so significant. And even when I tried to distract myself, thoughts of Jason and what had happened between us wouldn't leave me. Eric woke up the next morning, got up, had breakfast, and I was still sitting there with the feeling that something inside me was breaking. It was easier with him than with Jason, but that didn't mean I could return to the way things were before. Something had changed in our relationship, and it unsettled me. I felt that everything happening now wasn't a coincidence. It was something much deeper. With each passing day, I felt more and more as if I were standing at the crossroads of two worlds. Mom cared for me as always, but her help was more intuitive than conscious. She didn't press me, didn't try to engage me in conversations, but there was something in her actions that suggested she knew how hard it was for me. I could feel her gaze, her quiet concern. She made breakfast for me, tidied up the house, but none of this helped me shake the feeling that I didn't belong here. Something inside me began to shift. I couldn't escape the thought that I was in some sort of in-between state, neither here nor there. Mom tried to remind me that I was home, but there was something else in her words. She wasn't just calling me home. She was trying to hide her own fear for my well-being, unknowingly signaling to me that she felt something was wrong, that I needed to return to my life, at least outwardly. But the most troubling thing was that my thoughts were increasingly turning to Eric. His calmness, his confidence, his adult presence. All of it wouldn't leave me alone. I couldn't understand what exactly bothered me. He was just my brother, but with each passing day, I started noticing how much he had changed. His looks, his manner of carrying himself, even his silence. Everything seemed simultaneously unfamiliar and strangely attractive. He couldn't help but notice how strange I was acting. One day, when we were sitting together in the kitchen, he suddenly asked, "Are you okay? You don't seem like yourself. You've kind of closed off." I couldn't answer because I didn't know how to say what was troubling me. I just shrugged and smiled, trying to hide what was happening inside me. Eric remained silent, but I saw how his gaze became more watchful. He wasn't the shy, opinion-shy boy I remembered from childhood anymore. Now he was confident, and his eyes seemed almost too perceptive. That evening, I went for a walk, trying to clear my head. But every step, every glance at the world around me made me think only of how everything had changed. I felt the anxiety growing inside me, filling the space that had once been familiar and calm. Thoughts of Jason, of what had happened between us, of what was now unfolding in my home, wouldn't let go. As I was returning home, I saw Eric standing on the porch. He had his arms crossed over his chest, staring at the darkening sky. I approached him but couldn't find the words. We were silent, and in that silence, there was something I couldn't quite grasp. His presence beside me, his calmness and his confidence seemed to become a part of me, shifting my perception of everything happening. It will be okay, he said at last, without turning to look at me, as though he knew I needed to hear those words. I didn't answer, but I felt that his words were not just a comfort. They were something more. A few days later, after I had been trying to find my balance in this new, strange world, a moment occurred that I couldn't have predicted. It was late in the evening when we were all sitting at dinner, and the house had an atmosphere of tiredness but calmness. Mom was telling us about the neighbor who had recently had surgery and how she brought her food every day. We were all listening, but my attention was diverted to something else. To Eric. He was sitting across from me at the table, and suddenly, without warning, he took off his jacket, tossing it onto the back of his chair. There was something in that simple movement that made me lift my gaze sharply. He looked so confident. At that moment, I felt a jolt inside me. It seemed like nothing unusual. We were both adults, and all he did was take off his jacket. But in his gaze, in his posture, there was something new that I couldn't ignore. Our eyes met, and I felt the tension between us grow. There was something in his eyes that I hadn't expected. Some kind of interest, but not the kind that could be easily explained. He kept looking at me, and I felt something stir inside me, as if this was a violation of a familiar boundary, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. I turned away, trying to suppress this strange sensation, but it didn't fade. I could feel the anxiety rising within me, and with it came the realization that I could no longer live the way I had before. Something had changed. This wasn't just simple curiosity. I couldn't exactly understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. I could no longer ignore how strongly I was drawn to this person I had grown up with whom I had shared so much in my childhood. Eric seemed to notice my confusion, but he didn't say anything. He continued the conversation with Mom, laughing at her stories about the old neighbors. I sat there, feeling like I was standing on the edge of two worlds, not knowing what to do with these new feelings. Everything I had thought about what had happened between me and Jason, and everything that was happening here, now seemed much more complicated. Mom returned to the conversation, unaware of how tense I had become. I sat there, trying to restore my usual mask, but I already knew that everything I had thought about myself and my life no longer made sense. My perception had changed, and perhaps everything that had once seemed so obvious now was not so clear. After dinner, I quickly stood up and went to my room. Closing the door behind me, I sat on the bed, trying to process what had happened. Why had it suddenly become so difficult to breathe in his presence? Why did I start seeing him differently, as though he had ended up on the other side of this vast, invisible barrier that now separated us? I felt that this moment had become a point of no return, and perhaps now I had to make a decision about what to do with myself, with this situation, and with what had arisen between me and Eric. With each passing day, my thoughts about Jason grew increasingly uneasy. He hadn't come, hadn't called, and at this moment, as I was going through so many internal changes, he felt even more distant to me. We hadn't truly spoken in a long time, and I found myself asking more and more how it had come to be that I had ended up in this house, far away from him, from our life that once seemed so meaningful. I remembered how, not long ago, his presence had felt so natural to me that it was impossible to imagine myself without him. But now he was simply a shadow, a part of the past, and that fact was destroying me from the inside. All attempts to maintain even the illusion of a normal relationship disappeared the moment I realized how far apart we had become. But when I felt I could no longer keep this internal conflict inside, he suddenly called. He didn't call to check on me or suggest meeting up. He simply said, "I need to talk to you. This can't go on." His words sounded so cold and indifferent that I immediately understood. This was the end. In that moment, I realized there was nothing left between us that was worth saving. Our conversations, our glances, all of it had become a burden, a weight I couldn't shake off. Silence had become a concrete wall between us. He couldn't understand what I was going through, and I couldn't understand why he continued to hold on to what had once been. When I hung up, I felt the internal tension explode. I stood up and made a decision. I couldn't keep hiding my pain. I couldn't keep trying to reclaim what couldn't be reclaimed. The realization hit me like lightning. Everything that had connected me to Jason had long since lost its significance. We had both become strangers, and it didn't make sense anymore. I could no longer stay in this. Not with him. Not in the world I had desperately tried to preserve. But despite this realization, I felt how hard it was to move forward. The thought that everything I had known would collapse left me with a sense of loss I couldn't avoid. The thought of parting with Jason was painful, but at the same time, there was a sense of relief. I could no longer remain in that house, in those relationships, which had already become nothing more than echoes of what we had once shared. At the moment when I understood everything was over, I looked at Eric. He was there, as he always had been, but now everything between us seemed different. I could feel him looking at me, but his gaze was a little different. Not as it had been before. There was no sympathy, no concern as I had expected. There was only silence, and I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what to do next, but I understood one thing. I could no longer remain in the past. Several days had passed since Jason called, and everything that was happening felt to me like just a reflection of the inner struggle I couldn't stop. I tried to find peace in this new reality, but instead, I felt myself being pulled back more and more into the past, into that life I had tried to leave behind. I sat on the porch, looking at the empty garden, trying to figure out what to do. One thought kept growing inside me, becoming more and more obvious. I could no longer live the way I had before. Mom remained silent. She had, of course, noticed the changes in my behavior, but she didn't interfere. She had always been like that, giving me the freedom to make decisions, even if she couldn't understand them. But even her support couldn't help me feel confident. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing how to take a step forward. Eric stayed close, but now even his presence felt heavy. He was calm, confident as always, but that calmness seemed unattainable to me. There was something in his gaze, in his behavior that made me feel both irritated and in awe. His confidence made me feel vulnerable. He seemed like someone other than the Eric I remembered. He felt foreign to me, and I couldn't understand how all of this connected to my feelings, to what was happening in my life. I tried to force myself to stop thinking about him, to stop feeling what I couldn't explain. I cut off the thoughts that surfaced, but they returned like shadows, invisible but persistent. I continued to fight with myself, convincing myself that it was all just an illusion, that I shouldn't let myself feel what I was feeling. But one day, when I came back inside after a walk, I felt something pulling me toward his room. I didn't want to go, but my feet led me forward. And there I was, standing at the door, listening to him read something. I couldn't believe I was facing this choice again, a choice that seemed impossible. I realized that there was now an invisible boundary between us, and it couldn't be crossed. It was a moment when I understood that something had changed, that I couldn't go back to what was before. I stood at the door while he continued to read, not noticing my presence. I wanted to leave, close the door, and forget everything, but in that moment I understood that I wasn't going anywhere. I couldn't forget what had happened between us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something important and unresolved lingered. In that moment, I realized that there was a boundary between us, and it couldn't be crossed. I didn't know what to do with this realization, how to deal with what was happening inside me. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back. It all ended unexpectedly. One evening, as I was trying to gather the remnants of my old life, Jason came. Wordlessly. He stood in the doorway, awkwardly, as if he didn't know what he was doing here or how to behave. But his eyes were clear, determined. He looked at me, then at Eric, and his gaze lingered. In that moment, I felt how hard it was to breathe. I couldn't look him in the eye, but he seemed to be waiting for me to say something. Mom was in another room, occupied with her own tasks, and we stood in silence. Jason raised his hand as though about to say something, but instead of words, he simply said, "I need to talk to you." I nodded silently, not knowing what to say. At that moment, it seemed like even the air in the room had compressed, as if all our silences and unspoken things had gathered in that small, empty space. Eric sat in the corner, trying not to interfere, but his presence was still felt. His gaze was directed elsewhere, and I could feel that his calm and confidence were holding me back. That was his role in this scene, not to interfere, not to get involved. He couldn't understand what was happening between Jason and me, but I knew that in this silence and uncertainty was an invisible, yet strong wall. Jason stepped closer to me, his voice tense and quiet. "You decided to leave, and now I don't know what to do. We can't just remain silent, ignore each other." I couldn't respond. Everything I thought seemed insignificant. I was too tired of the silence, of the unsaid things we both kept inside. My soul was overflowing with contradictions, and I could no longer hide it. The silence between us had become a heavy burden that I couldn't carry. Eric stood up, walked toward us, but didn't interfere, standing beside me as if helping me find my way out of the labyrinth we had created for ourselves. Jason looked confused, but still tried to hold the conversation. "I can't keep living like this," he said. "I feel like you've become a stranger. What happened?" I remained silent. I stood there, feeling the tension grow, feeling my hesitation in his eyes turn into a desire to take a step forward. But taking a step forward was no longer possible. I couldn't return to the past. I couldn't stay in a relationship that no longer made sense. "I don't know what to do," I finally said, but my voice lacked strength. "I can't be with you anymore, Jason. We've both changed. Everything has changed." Pain flickered in his eyes, but not surprise. He understood. He already knew this moment had come. We stood in a room that, to me, seemed completely foreign to both of us. And in that moment, I realized that this was the end. The end of what once bound us, and the end of what we had tried to preserve. Jason turned silently and left. Mom must have felt that everything was coming to an end, but she didn't interfere. She understood that this step was inevitable. And so, I was left alone, facing an enormous unknown. I stood in the empty house where there was no past, no future. All I knew was that this life could no longer be mine. And now, I had to decide what to do next. Several days passed before I truly understood what had happened. Everything I had once considered a part of my life was gone, leaving a void. Mom spoke little, but her eyes said everything. I couldn't hide from her that my soul was in turmoil, that I couldn't find a way back, nor understand how to move forward. Jason was gone. He had left, and I didn't know what would become of us, of this part of my life that once seemed inevitable. But in that moment, when I stood at the threshold of this new reality, I felt how liberation mixed with the bitterness of loss. I couldn't explain to myself exactly what I had lost, but it was a true loss. Everything that had connected me to him dissolved into the emptiness, like water slipping through fingers. Mom didn't ask questions, didn't try to interfere with my thoughts, but I knew she saw. She saw my pain and confusion, and perhaps, at moments when her gaze softened, she understood that I needed time. Time to understand what was happening inside me. Time to let go of the past. And Eric? He remained by my side. He didn't interfere with my feelings, didn't ask questions, but in his silent presence, I felt the support I had been missing. He was so calm, so self-assured. Sometimes when I looked at him, I felt as if his gaze skimmed over me, trying to understand what lay behind the shadow in my eyes. He didn't ask about Jason. He didn't try to interfere in my life. In those days, as I tried to sort out my thoughts, I realized I needed to rediscover what I had left behind. I couldn't return to the life I had before this moment, and I didn't want to. Everything I had experienced had changed me, and I had to accept that. Mom suggested helping me return to work, to the life that awaited me beyond this house, but I felt that now I had to figure things out on my own. I needed time to understand how to be with this new version of myself, the one that had emerged from all these changes. I began searching for answers within myself, trying to understand what I wanted from this new life. It wasn't easy. Inside me, the old world continued to fight against the new one. And then I realized that loss wasn't the end, but the beginning. The beginning of a new life, one in which I would be true to myself, where I would stop looking for answers in other people and instead seek them within myself. I didn't know where this path would lead me, but now I was ready to take the step. Eric continued to stay close, and perhaps it was his presence that helped me understand what mattered to me.